We saw actually the context of the asymmetric scenario last class, and we defined that this is the second approach via which the professional use of the cryptography, the asymmetric uh, cryptography is another scenario, but via the usage of the private public keys elements as actors. We are not still seeing the cryptography for its purpose only, but we are adopting it for different communication scenarios. We are securing what we are going to communicate as media in between remote parties. We define the digital envelope, and through which we saw clearly the use of the it's an asymmetric cryptography that plays the role here. We are encrypting using a secret key. We can say it's a secret key by the secret key to the sender. We are encrypting the key itself. This key is already used to encrypt the media to communicate. The encrypted key value plus the encrypted media value, both of them, both of them, they are gathered together in a digital value, nominated digital envelope. Digital envelope. This digital envelope that holds those two values would be sent to the receiver from the other side, and this digital value, digital envelope, would be segregated. Its content would be segregated. The key value, the encrypted key value, in addition to the encrypted media value, both of them they are going to be decrypted using the same standard utilized. Yet a key here actually, which is a private key available at the sender, sorry, at the receiver side, that matches the public key used to encrypt the key used to encrypt the media. This is a public key. This is a private key. This private key would be utilized to decrypt the key that has been encrypted using a public key or a private key, or let's say symmetric key. The generated value is the original key, the original symmetric key used by the sender to encrypt the media. This generated key here will be utilized to decrypt the value of the media, the encrypted value of the media, which would generate the original media. Great. This is actually an adoption or an application of the cryptography, the asymmetric cryptography. This is an application of the asymmetric cryptography. And Hanouf and Mariam, they are coming now. Okay. Great. Um, the keys actually we talk about here, actually the keys they are now getting involved more and more. We are seeing more keys in action, and we are defining keys in the scenario of the cryptography more and more. At the beginning, if you remember at the beginning when we defined the cryptography, we saw only one key, one conventional key, one symmetric key in between the sender and the key, the same key value. It is to be utilized at the encryption side, and also at the decryption side. It's the same key, same value to be utilized. Now we are clearly seeing more and more keys that they are actually being involved in the scenario of the cryptography. And seeing this digital envelope, we are seeing three keys. A symmetric key to be seen at the both sides, which is a random value, a random symmetric key, and a public and a private and an encrypted value of the symmetric key. So key, it's actually a scenario that it is getting persistent and repeatedly used. Great. The keys, actually the generation of those keys here, when we said that it is a random symmetric key, there is a scenario where they are numbers, they are actually values, digital values available on the computer side, so it has to be utilized. Random value means whether it is a numerical value or alphabetical value or an alphanumerical value or something actually like that, but the computer can utilize in the digital format. generation of the symmetric key or the random symmetric keys, actually there are standards which we have to follow in order to achieve this to achieve the availability to get those keys. The random numbers actually so generating random numbers is one of the solutions via which we try to adopt in order to generate keys. Random numbers. We just generate an algorithm or you just utilize a standard that generates random numbers. Okay, that's good. So we can. This is one of the solutions. We among the application or the system that, for example, use this generation of digital envelope, we adopt an algorithm that generates random numbers, and the number to be generated here is the key we will use to encrypt the media. And the same one we are going to use here to decrypt the cipher to generate the original media. Random number, symmetric key, the random symmetric key is the same value here and here, but from where we get it is because of a random number generated, no more, no less. Uh, One of the benefits of this being that it is random, none can recognize. It is not recognized. It is not predictable. It is not predictable. It means actually it is a value that the computer only will generate at the runtime only. Means once the computer calls the random methodology or random algorithm, it would at that time generate the random number. So it is actually one of the positive side of this randomness. So whenever we need a random number, just we call the standard and a new random number would be generated. Great. Random numbers, actually, there are scenarios how to generate them. There are methodologies, there are standards and different methodologies and standards also to generate random numbers. There are fully random numbers or pseudo random numbers, partially random numbers, in the sense of the random numbers, they are completely random in the sense of means it is random. We do not know any hint about the random. Is it just one digit? Is it a 10 digits number? Is it a very huge number? We don't know. It's random. Completely, it is up to the computer to generate that number. So it is much more harder to detect when we compare to the pseudo-random number. The pseudo-random number, there is a range. For example, we say that it has to be actually made up of 5 digits max. So easy. We have it's not easy, but it's much more easier to detect, to predict when we compare it to the random number. The random, it's much more easier to predict. So it's much more easier to get and to actually at that time we can break the algorithm utilized to encrypt if this one is predictable. So we can decrypt the media if it is intercepted in between. That's those are two perspectives, either the pseudo random or the random. Both of them, they are okay scenarios via which we can generate uh, symmetric keys randomly, but which one is better, it depends on the scenario. You may say actually we go only for the random numbers. Remember, whenever we talk about a bigger key size, we are talking about more time to consume in addition to more memory space for the process. So it's not the definite choice to go for the random numbers to generate keys. No, there is a constraint, the time and the memory size. So it's not usually the best. It's not usually the best. It is the best, yes, for security purposes without constraints. So if you don't talk about the time as a constraint, if we don't talk about the memory size about constraint as a constraint also, so the random numbers methodology or process is the best. But if we talk about an application to be fast, random numbers as keys as a solution, it's not the best. It's not the best. It is a time-consuming process, and it is a memory space-consuming process also. This one, it consumes less time, maybe. It consumes less memory space also, maybe. But it is less secure when we compare to the random generation, random numbers standards. The random, it is a non-deterministic randoms. They are non-deterministic in the sense of they are actually not given any hint about the size. At least non-deterministic. It's a technical description of a value state. It is not being deterministic, no more or less. We do not have actually a hint to say that this is the start and this is the end. We may we may have an open range, an open segment of values where it is hard to determine the value of the generated random key. Okay, applications where we can see the cryptography are so many. We saw examples, and still it's not all. Actually, the cryptography. Remember, in conclusion, it is not something to run for itself. We adopt cryptography to secure what we have to communicate as media. The cryptography, it is not. It is a security scenario, yes, but it does not work for itself. We encrypt and decrypt media. The media in plural is the values we share as users, as end users, customers, producers, business owners in the digital environment usually. Thank you for this for following this unit. Any questions, please? I give you the chance to interact regarding the cryptography unit. Please, do you have any questions regarding the cryptography in general?
No, Mister.
No, Mister.
Okay, that's good. So that's good. So
No,
still
Mister.
great, great. Unit number three. Up to number three, it is the authentication context. As per the digital security, remember, if you remember the terminologies, at the time we defined the identification and the authentication. We said the identification is to prove who is to say, to present your ID. I am Fulan. I am. This is your ID only. Username and password. This is your ID, the card, and so on. But the authentication is another security scenario, another security mechanism that comes after in chronological order after the identification. I am Fulan. To prove that you are Fulan, it is the authentication process. So we have to go behind the proven your ID or proven an ID that we present versus a system or an environment or platform. And this proof is the authentication process. The authentication or user's authentication is one of the cyber security context because all the services delivered over the web, they have to be actually delivered to authenticated parties, whomever you are, or whatever the service you ask. You have to be authenticated, you as a user. Authenticated to whom? To the system that delivers you a service or a list of services. An overview of this uh, unit or entity, we are going to see the authentication mechanisms. There are principles via which we are going to deploy any mechanism of authentication. Uh, we see them one by one. The very famous actually is the password, and the very weak amongst all is the password also. This is the very famous and the very weak amongst the others. But still it is persistent, famous, weak, and persistent. We will see why. We will see why, just in a while. You'll be actually, as an objective of this unit, you'll be able to authenticate a user, and you'll be able to explain why the context of the actually selected authentication mechanism is the best or not. Taking the example of the password based, as I said, it is the very famous, the weakest, and the still persistent up to date, more more than the others when compared to all. Actually, you'll be able to go behind the technical specificities of a password-based authentication system. We see actually other mechanisms and other principles in action, and we'll be able to classify this or that, and when we need this or that. Definition, first definition actually. Uh, the authentication, it's a scenario via which we prove the ID of a user, and it's a process that precedes the access control process. A user versus a system has to present his ID, and to present his ID, he has to prove that he is the one owning that ID. I am Fulan. Once, for example, we take the example of the University of Lisbon ID. To access the services that we take the example of the University of Lisbon EduWave. And to use the EduWave services, you have to present your ID and prove that you are the owner of the ID. For example, the ID is your ID number. Your ID number, you as a student. Your ID number, you have to prove that it is yours by presenting a password. So you're given the ID, and your colleague can get your ID. But the password, if you prove that the password is correct, you can give a correct password, so you are authenticating yourself versus the EduWave as a system. So, proving your ID through a use of a password gives you the chance to access the system, and there will be an access control to give you a list of dedicated services according to your session, according to your ID. So the authentication is a preceding step to the access control. It's a scenario via which a user authenticates and proves his ID versus system usually. It's the process of verifying your ID. Okay, there is two steps to do, or there are two steps to do when we authenticate the user versus system. Is to present the ID somehow, and to verify that ID. As I given the example now, you present your username or your ID number to the EduWave, and to prove that it is your ID, to specify your identifier is the ID number, for example, and to verify that your ID is correct, you give your password. There is a scenario here actually that verifies that. Those two steps, they are the authentication mechanism. This is not the message authentication scenario. This is not what we saw in the cryptography entity. If you remember in unit number 2 last class, not today, in the cryptography chapter, we presented the message authentication code and the message authentication scenario. The MAC, if you remember very well, it is not the message authentication here. It's not the same authentication. That authentication is not the same authentication we talk in this unit. Okay, great. So actually, authentication scenario, it is a process that needs actors to play each to play the role, finalize what we are requiring to do, which is to award access to a system, award the user or a subject access to a system. Clearly here, the actors are the claimant, which is the user in question, that he is saying, I am Fulan, I want to access. He is the claimant. The second party is the environment or the process or the engine to verify you once you prove your ID. The engine. He actually talk about the verifier. Whatever he is. The one that proves your ID is a verifier. The one that proves the claimant ID verifies. The claimant ID to verify means it would say yes, you are validated, or no, you are not validated. Both answers are to be done by the verifier. And the answers that this verifier would provide to the claimant saying that yes, you are authenticated, no, you are not authenticated. It is based on the authentication party, which is a reliant party that authenticates entities based on a database entity or based on a file system or something like that. There are values stored in background that the verifier uses to authenticate, to verify claimants. So in conclusion here, the claimants they are the actors in an authentication scenario, they are three: the claimant, the verifier, and the verifying party, or let's say the reliant party. Reliant party, it's we can take the example of the database. Okay, let's continue. This is a graph that draws exactly the role here of those actors and how a user can get actually being authenticated in a digital environment. We have actually a claimant that has to be subscribed. We have a claimant that has to be subscribed. Subscribed to whom? To an environment. And once it is subscribed, there is a reliant party that would actually store his data. Actually, his data would be stored somewhere. The reliant party will count on his data, which is to be saved somewhere. The subscriber or the claimant here, he would submit his username, his password, his ID, his email, his contact, and everything would be submitted. It is the registration process. Registration authority will read that. If you are required to give your mobile number, you have to give your mobile number, not an email. So there is a verification here. The registration party will verify that and will give you the authority, yes, to go on. Once your registration happened, your credential, or let's say the list of credentials, are going to be saved in the, let's say, CSP, which is the registration, still registration authority background, something like that. Here, your credentials, username, your password, your email, your contact, all your data is being registered here inside the system in background. And usually there will be a chance to give you actually an ID. Here we talk about a token or maybe username or something like that you can use later on to authenticate yourself versus the system. Okay, the registration phase, it is this box here, the left side. You present your values according to the field set for the registration. There will be actually an input validation. There will be an input validation in this level only. And this input validation would actually check up, validate, verify. Once, yes, positively verified your credentials, they would be saved in a credential DB, let's say, credential-based environment. And later on, those values, they would be communicated with the relaying party and the verifier to give you access to the system or not. The token to be generated for you and stored in the environment, it is the same one to be given to the verifier to verify you. The credential you give, username and password, the credit card or whatever you give to the verifier, he will match with the credentials available in the background. If they are the same, it will tell the relying party, yes, authenticated, let him in. There will be a session generated for you, for the claimant, mainly, not for everybody who is trying to access or subscribe or whatever. Any questions, please, at this level? Is the
No question.
No
okay?
question, Mr.
Is this model clear to you?
Yes, clear, Master.
So great, yeah, great. We continue. Generally, the authentication here, it's not a secret to do, and we talk about still that we are talking about authentication only, but how it would happen is authentication using a username and password only. Is it the unique authentication mechanism? It is it the unique authentication paradigm? The answer is no. There is a rule behind of setting any authentication process. Based on the services or the list of the services, we set up a rule how to authenticate users versus the system. This rule says to authenticate a user has to know something, or the user has to possess something, or a user is something, or a user does something. Any user or any actor or any claimant to be authenticated versus a relying party, this claimant has to know something, or to possess something, or to be something, or to do something. Know something like username and password, like a PIN to activate your credit card or your SIM card. To possess something, it's a token, or let's say credit card or smart card, like University of Newsbury cards. To be something, actually to have actually your fingerprint or your eye print, retina, yes, your body print is to be something. It's you yourself, your body. To do something, to speak, to sign using your hand, something like that. So one of those categories, they are to classify which model or which principle we follow to authenticate users. But in all cases, a user to be authenticated, he has to fall into one of those categories. We may adopt more than one to authenticate users for a severe authentication process, but usually one would be successfully authenticating users. One of those actually authentication means. Okay, like any actually cybersecurity concern, the authentication process, it is set only to eliminate threats and to cover vulnerabilities. Okay, threats and vulnerabilities that they can be caused due to a non-secure process when authenticating candidates is to be classified into levels. It is a common sense understanding here. Either we are talking about a very weak confidence, whatever, very weak authentication, let's say, trust, or a very high and severe confidence, which is actually very, very high sensitivity versus the authentication process. There is a problematic view strongly causing problems when non-authenticated or non-secure authenticated well, or just actually small damage, a small problem, or small problematic view when we do not authenticate users. So it's a common understanding here. There are 4 levels. Little confidence means we do not have to, the users, they are not authenticated well, the users, they are not authenticated well, or there is a little bit some more than the first level, the level 2, which is actually we talk about professional work. Is it is not to be accessed by everybody, and thus the authentication has to be set for professional activities only. It is not a public platform, but even though for this professional activity, the confidence has to be set also for some confidence. There is a respected level of confidence that has to be seen when authenticating parties. There is a respected level, means there is a high confidence. Here we talk about the digital presence of entities over, let's say, the public platforms. Digital presence of entities over the public platforms, like the patent office, let's say, agencies, or let's say representations, or let's say members, or something like that is an example only. Or a very high confidence has to be seen when authenticating parties. Very high. Here we talk about the very classified environments, restricted areas, or let's say sensitive services, like nuclear or medical, something like that, pharmaceutical, sensitive work activities or fields. They have to be highly controlled when authenticating individuals. So what a level we have to follow, it is a common sense also. Still we have to talk about this or that based on the authentication process that we need, or that the service needs. The same description we saw in the previous paragraph, in the previous view, previous slide. It is seen here in this table. We are going to classify low, high based on the service to deliver, based on the service to deliver, or the service described. We specify the level of the confidence that has to be actually set. Yes, level 1, level 2, level 3, whatever. So usually here there is no technical, it's a subdivision of the authentication level based on the context. If we are just delivering news, like the forum, like the example of the forum, there is nothing to be here. So everything has to be given to all without any restriction. It's a very low authentication process required only. We do not have to block that. But when you talk about pharmaceutical, or we talk about medicinal activities, everything is very sensitive. So it's very high. This one has to be actually high, yes. This has to be available, whatever. Good. The first principle that we have to go behind is, we are going to define the first authentication scenario is the password-based authentication process, via which user has to authenticate his status or his request by providing a user ID and a user password, recognized by the login name and the password field in all the systems that they follow or apply password-based authentication process. The username and password, the password authentication process, clearly identifies the privileges to be given to an individual. To make you understand this process here, we take the example of the University of Venezuela UA. We are all, me and you, me as an instructor and you as students, for example, we use the same username field, the same password field, and the same page to authenticate ourselves to the UA, to open. I use the same text box for the username and the same password box for the password, like the same that you use. But for me, I can open, and when I open, actually, when I give correct username and password, I can open and I see all of your profiles, all of your courses, your grades, your all what you have as actually in your profiles. But you, when you open and you give a username and password correctly, you see only your own username, your own profile, your own courses, your own timetable, only yours. You not see the other students' profiles. You will not. How it happens? It is based on the username and password we given to the interface. There is a privilege given to you. There is a privilege given to you. You are a student, so you not see the others. You are an instructor, so you see all of your students. This is the privilege given to you based on your authenticated values. And this is actually because of the authentication mechanism. There are mechanisms we discuss later on. This is discretionary, عشوائي. It's a discretionary access control. Access control. This is a methodology that it is to be classified as a discretionary methodology. It's a دخول عشوائي. تصنف على أنه دخول عشوائي due to the way how you are, because what is your ID? It might be a number, it might be a username textual representation, it might be alphanumerical, and your password is something clearly from your side only, so it is not something standardized by all systems across all the digital platforms. No, thus it is a discretionary access control mechanism. Actually, this is a scenario via which we may apply the authentication mechanism, the password-based mechanism. Yes, as we said, yes, he will define it. Yet there are drawbacks. There are a lot of drawbacks regarding the password-based authentication systems. Those drawbacks, they cause a lot of vulnerabilities which they can be explored by attackers. And they have to be actually tackled at every time a system is using a password-based authentication process. Amongst of them, and the very famous one is the dictionary attack or the brute force attack. We find that in the cryptography 2 times. The dictionary attack or the brute force attack, those are scenarios via which we use a dictionary to attack users. Dictionary of passwords to attack and to try to guess the access. And this is actually one of the very famous attacks against the password-based authentication process. Any questions at this level, please, before I continue?
No,